Welcome to episode 1 of Overcome Out Loud with Charlie Smith. It is so great for us to be launching this podcast, something that's been a vision of ours for some time now. I'm here with my co-host and really good friend, Chaz Neneker. Chaz, say hi.
Hello, everyone.
And our creative woman, Heather Murdoch, who's over on the laptop, making sure that technically this thing works like it's supposed to. It's something new for us, which I'm really excited about. What is Overcome Out Loud? So the purpose of why we're doing this is to provide a forum for discussion between us and some real people that have overcome real obstacles and challenges in their lives, and sharing with us real solutions that they've used to overcome those obstacles. And I think one of the things that I've often talked about is I've launched into much more of a public forum to discuss my passion, which is breaking the stigma around alcoholism, substance abuse, addiction, and childhood trauma and the effects of childhood trauma. I have found so many people impacted by the nature of the things that I've overcome, and also having themselves having to have crawled out of a dark spot in their own lives. And I think there's power in those stories, and I think there's power in a message of hope. And I think there's a real power in having people share those real solutions with people. And my goal here is to provide, real actionable items, with everybody we have on, Chaz, that, when we get to kind of the bottom of the darkest point in their lives, that as they start to walk out of those spots, that they can share with our listeners, exactly the things that they did, and the tools that they used that other people can access. So despite how anybody who's listening to this podcast may feel, whether it's anxiety, depression, worry, substance abuse, eating disorders, any mental health issue or addiction issue, that we're giving listeners some hope, and we're giving listeners some real things that they can do to climb out of that. And I know that's a passion that you share. And I just want to thank you for supporting this effort and for being such an integral part of setting it up, my man. It's so great to have you across from me and to have Heather, by our side as we do this, right?
Yeah, thank you, Charlie. I'm just really happy we got it together, and now we're launching it.
Yeah, that's right. So, by way of background, I come here today at the age of 54, having overcome a lot of adversity in my life. And so one of the things that I wanted to do is kind of just give a little bit of background. I thought that would be helpful so people understand the nature of the things that I kind of hid from. The kind of, the inspiration for the podcast name is that I suffered in silence. And I think many people do suffer in silence, and it's time to overcome out loud. And I think there's power in story, and there's power in people's ability to speak openly about how they've overcome obstacles. And, we can end a lot of suffering, and that's really my goal. And when I look at the people that I surround myself with and my mentors, people that are mentoring me, like Dave Meltzer and George Mumford and Mike Diamond, and, a lot of the people that'll be on this podcast, I think they all share that common value of hoping to improve the level of happiness and contentment, fulfillment in people's lives, and share real ways to do that. Yeah, but that always hasn't always been the case for me. Chaz, I grew up, so I'm 54, and while I live in California, I'm not from California. I actually grew up 3,500 miles from here, just outside of a small town in Portland, Maine, called Scarborough, Maine. And from the outside world, as I was younger, my family looked just like every other family in town for the most part. My father was a college professor. My mother was a first grade school teacher. I think in the early 70s, we were actually featured on the cover of Catholic Digest magazine in the greater Portland area as kind of a model Catholic family who attended church every Sunday. But none of that displayed the real truth of what was going on behind closed doors at our home, and our secret. And the secret was that from the age of 5 until the age of about 21, that I was violently, physically, and emotionally abused at the hands of my father. It's a long stretch. People talk about childhood trauma, and now I think more and more people are talking about complex trauma, which is a series of events that occur to a developing child over a period of time.
Yeah, so what is that? What's complex trauma?
So complex trauma is as opposed to PTSD, the way complex trauma is being described is it's repeated episodes of traumatic events that are leaving multiple imprints to where your mind actually believes that that's the state that you live in.
So is that normally abuse, like from from family, or can that be something other than that?
It can be something other than that. Complex trauma can be any repeated trauma that occurs over and over again. So if somebody's being victimized by an uncle or a family member, or if somebody's being bullied at school, repeatedly over and over again and experiencing that, multiple times, they'll suffer what's called complex trauma, because the brain will actually start to transform and start to react to that trauma over and over again, so that even when that trauma is present, the brain is still experiencing the fear associated with that trauma. It's one of the things that I experienced as I was growing up from that violent abuse. And I often share with people, the reason I tell that is not for sympathy. It's not for effect. And it's not because I'm a victim of that. I mean, the reason I share that part of my story is really for two reasons. One, because it's the truth. And for so many years, I wanted to hide and run from that truth. I was ashamed. I was guilty. I felt there was something wrong with me. And I couldn't really put a finger on what it was, but I know I didn't really like the way I felt about myself. And so I hid from that truth and literally suffered in silence as a result of the way I was brought up. So I think, one of the reasons, and I went through a series of, and I'll talk more about the healing that I've done, but part of the healing I did was in a process group for people that had suffered childhood trauma and that were in their adult ages. And one of the things that Dr. Bruce Gregory, who remains a good friend of mine, always said is it is just the truth, and so I wanted to deny that was the truth, and it created something called disassociation, because I couldn't actually live my authentic life because I was creating these false selves. So I tell that part of the story because it has so much to do with how I developed as a child and a young adult and a young man. The other reason I tell that, I think, you know this as well as anybody, Chaz, that by statistics, 85% or more of people that suffer from a substance abuse disorder, alcoholism, addiction, eating disorders, or other forms of addiction and alcoholism, suffered some form of childhood trauma. There's a direct correlation between traumatic events and engagement and induction into substance abuse, and it's not by mistake. I mean, there's a direct relationship to a desire at a young age, for me, speaking from experience. And again, I'm always very clear. I probably should be clear as a disclaimer when we run this podcast or when we broadcast this podcast that I have no initials after my name. We'll have subject matter experts on this podcast regularly to talk about some of the more technical parts of this, but these are my experiences, having dealt with these matters personally myself, how they affected my life, how they affected my personal development, professionally, emotionally, socially. Literally every aspect of my life was jeopardized and modified and literally changed the way I related to life as a result of these experiences. And so when I share these things, they're the experiences that I've had to overcome them, and they're the things that I've done. But by no means am I dispensing therapeutic messages or medical diagnoses. We're just here to share, right?
Yeah, but I mean, my opinion of that is still that you have worldly knowledge of what you're talking about. I know you're not, the doctorate, but it's not like you don't have. It's not like your opinion isn't backed by experience and your successes and failures in each thing that you've tried. So the things that you say come from your own experience and also what you've seen work and what you've seen not work. So I wouldn't, it doesn't discredit. In fact, most people would agree that your knowledge of the subject is enough to probably have a doctorate in it, but I'm just, it's not that your opinions are as important to me as any doctor, really. I just want to make sure that that's clear.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that's one of the things that will come out through this is the importance of experience. There's always that theoretical and practical application of any kind of knowledge, and then there's the real life, experiential practice of that knowledge. And so for me, it's having walked through each of these things and sitting here today as a sober man who has a much improved opinion of myself and have rebuilt my self-esteem, and it's been a long journey to do that. And so yeah, that's why I share that story. And the other reason I share that story is because it's interesting to me how clear it's become to me that a few of the patterns that developed when I was younger as a result of growing up with traumatic experiences occurring on a regular basis. For the first part of that, I would say I learned the habit of being dishonest. I learned to lie at a very young age, and it sounds a little odd that an adolescent or a young child would learn that pattern of dishonesty, because sometimes we lie as kids to not get in trouble. Did you break that? No, I didn't. And that's a form of, I think, innocent adolescent dishonesty that all of us have experienced. But for me, it was much more traumatic, because what I actually began to lie about was who I am. So it started to expand from just lying about what had happened to actually lying about who I was. And that's where I think the concept of disassociation came into effect for me, because I learned at a very young age that to be me was not safe. No matter how I showed up in my home, I was subject to violent episodes. And again, I say this for clarity. I'm not talking about, I want to differentiate discipline from abuse. I'm not talking about a heavy-handed father. I'm not talking about somebody who wanted his rules followed or you might get the belt. And I'm not talking about a disciplinarian. I'm talking about a violent man. I'm talking about experiencing from the age of 5 or 6, punches to my face with a closed fist to a bloody nose. I've had my head bashed against brick fireplaces and door jams in our home to almost being unconscious. At the age of 21, as a young adult, I finally, came to realize, the violence never stopped even as I got older. And my father had a .45 caliber pistol to my head at Christmas time with his knee on my chest. And I had a younger brother who was in the Navy who fortunately had the courage to knock him off of me. And I left the house and really never returned after that event. So you can imagine how a child experiencing that level of trauma, that level of violence over an extended period of time can be impacted. I don't think people really understand the effect of childhood trauma on the developing brain, especially when it occurs over that long period of time, right?
Yeah.
And so I learned to lie about myself, because see, what would happen is I would go to school as a young man, and it's the brain knows, okay, and the brain keeps score, the body keeps score. I think there's a book by an author whose name escapes me called The Body Keeps the Score. And what you have to understand is that being subjected to violent physical and emotional trauma impacts and activates a different part of the brain, usually the amygdala, which is kind of our reptilian brain, which is where our reactions to adverse experiences happen, right? So it's fight, flight, or freeze. And as a sufferer of childhood trauma, that part of my brain was highly activated, which means I was always in a state of being aware of impending dangers, right? And I was also very conditioned to either flee or freeze. For me, because of the young age that my abuse started at, I didn't really have a fight component to my interactions with the violence. I was so overwhelmed by the size and magnitude of the violence that for me to stand up for myself wasn't an option. So it was really that flee or freeze mentality.
And all the time, you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, there was
Even when you're out of the house.
Yeah, I mean, there was just no way for me to differentiate that the adults at school were safe and the adults at home were not safe. My brain was kind of always on high alert.
Right.
And so I would see kids going to school, when I was young, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, and, they'd have their shiny lunch boxes, and I knew they weren't covering up bruises. I knew they weren't holding back tears. I didn't, and I knew that they weren't living the life that I was living. So I learned that if I wanted to fit in with them, that I really desperately wanted to be one of them. And so I started to learn to lie about my life, that I went on vacations like they did, that my parents helped me with my homework like they did, that I watched sports like that. Whatever I could do to kind of mask the fact that I was uncomfortable in my own skin at that young age, I would do. And so I learned that disassociation, create this false self, which wasn't me. I was afraid I was anxious, I was worried, I was on edge, and I couldn't tell anybody about it. It was my secret. So the only way I could fit in was by creating another version of myself. And when you do that, you create this incongruency, because subconsciously I knew that it wasn't the truth. And subconsciously I knew,
Right.
and was ashamed and was guilty of the fact that I really wasn't who I said I was, even at that young age. And it created a lot of emotional dysregulation for me, kind of always being in that anxious state. And I believe, as you know from spending so much time with me, Chaz, that I believe that anything that we do in pattern, we do regularly because we get a payoff from it, right? And so for me, learning to lie gave me a payoff of not having to face the reality of what was going on in my home. And so I learned that pattern of dishonesty. There's another interesting part of my story that I learned, because I think a lot of people will look at the success that I've had from a business standpoint and from a personal development standpoint, and they'll wonder how, with all of these things going on, where did my innate ability to, succeed come from, or to excel come from? And it's a good question, right? Because the other pattern I learned when I was growing up was that to be out of my house, I was either allowed to be at school or at work. Those were the two things that my father would view as acceptable activities for me to be engaged in. So what did I do? I was either at school or I got jobs. I started picking peas at the age of 13, at a local farm just up the street from our house. And from the age of 13 till now, the age of 54, I've been gainfully employed. And I was a compliant worker, and so I think we all can look back at these coping skills, and we can see and measure certain things that appear on the outside to be able to deal with these things, but they're not true resilience. All they are is avoidance. That's what it was for me. It was avoidance. It wasn't really dealing with what I was going through. And, I have one of the many sayings that I hold true is, what you don't deal with will deal with you. And so I stuffed and buried this existence of my youth, for 42 years, and ultimately the check got paid, and I hit an emotional and a physical and an addiction, and a bottom in my addiction from having to avoid and negate all of these experiences.
So when did the problems start for you? Or I shouldn't say the problems. I should say, when did the issue of substances start becoming a problem, where it was affecting your work or your life?
Well, surprisingly young. I started drinking at the age of 12. My developing brain was looking for an escape, and I call substance abuse and alcoholism and addiction a chemical solution to an emotional problem. So when I had the opportunity to pick up a drink when I was 12 years old, I found an escape from reality, right? I mean, it was the great escape. As soon as
Right.
I drank that vodka and orange juice at my friend Eric Knott's house when his parents were away, I immediately felt relief. I immediately felt comfortable. I immediately felt like I could disconnect from the violence that was at my home, and I felt safe for the first time. And so I would say immediately my mind realized that I could always escape reality in an unhealthy way. And I became, and the disease of addiction and alcoholism, it's three things, right? It's chronic, which means it never goes away. It's progressive, which over time it gets worse. It never gets better. And it's deadly, so ultimately, whether it's, on the installment plan because of just long and arduous drinking and drug use, our body fails, or ultimately we suffer some consequence and some fate. Many times you'll see it in an obituary in the paper, that's not labeled as any known disease. It'll say after a brief illness, such and
Right.
such died, or maybe died of some unrelated topic, but really at the end of the day, it was the result of untreated alcoholism or addiction, and it's wiped out a number of people in my family, which we'll talk about some of the consequences in my life. So, but it started for me at 12, and what started for me at 12 was finding a chemical solution to these emotional problems, and I knew that when I drank, that all of those feelings I had of unworthiness, of not fitting in, of not being good enough, they went away. All of that fear, all of that anxiety went away. It calmed down my nervous system, and it made me disconnect. And ultimately, as a result of the failure to engage the prefrontal cortex, which is our logical part of our brain, which occurred both for me in school and when I was drinking, you start to engage in unhealthy behaviors, which creates shame and guilt and a pattern of substance abuse. So really, I started drinking at 12. And the other effect of childhood trauma, which I speak openly about, whenever I have an opportunity to at schools, elementary schools, with principals, and even at colleges, because when a child has a trauma impacted brain and they've been suffering complex trauma or abuse or neglect, and they're in that amygdala, can you imagine learning in that mind space?
Oh yeah, no way.
And so as I look back, and we've done this a few times, you and Heather and I, preparing for some of our talks, we've looked back at those early report cards in elementary school, and we can see the kinds of things that were going on with me from a learning standpoint. I was inconsistent. I was a conduct problem. I was a behavioral problem. I was unable to, do the normal kinds of learning exercises that kids my age were doing. I was missing pages in workbooks. I was late on homework assignments. There was all of these kind of negative learning consequences as a result of my inability to pay attention, to be present, and to be able to participate in class like normal kids, because my brain was so engaged in being on guard, that I couldn't differentiate safe from danger, and school was a bit of a minefield for me in that respect. And actually, I was put into learning. I was put into special ed for a number of months. Although I wasn't learning disabled, I appeared that way. Whether it was early diagnosis of ADHD or a learning disability, it was what is wrong with this kid? He seems smart. He seems at times to be able to learn, but he's disruptive in class, highly disruptive in class. He's behind on his assignments. He's not able to pay attention. He's taking away from time from other kids in the class. It was this constant seeking attention in a negative way, and it was viewed by my teachers at the time as something being wrong with me. But there was really no way for them to, at the time, assess that something at home might be going wrong. In fact, they were sending letters home to my parents. Imagine a college professor getting these letters home about his child, being disruptive in class and causing. I remember report card day was just. It was
probably a nightmare. Huh?
Yeah, exactly. Report card day and teacher parent conferences. Those were 2 days growing up when I look back that created enormous stress and anxiety in me as I was growing up, because I knew. I just knew the teachers weren't happy with me. I knew my dad wasn't happy with me. Virtually nobody in my life was happy with me, which of course made it harder for me to be happy with me.
What about college though? After you didn't have to report to family anymore.
Well, it's interesting. I think one of the things that we're going to talk a lot about on this podcast over the next few years as we're doing this is the power of our mindset and mental conditioning, and how what we believe can really impact how we feel, and how we feel can really impact what we do, and what we do kind of generates the results in our lives, right? It's our life is the result of a bunch of actions that we take. Really from the time our feet hit the floor in the morning, we're always in action or not in action. We're always making choices. And so it's interesting that you bring that up, because one of the points that I've learned and focused on is, from 7th and 8th grade to 9th grade, I had a really interesting event occur with my mom, who had a conversation with me about that age, that the abuse that was going on at home essentially wasn't going to end, and that the only way that she could keep me safe was if I could get to college. So what's interesting is my perspective, my belief around school went from a threat to an opportunity. So my mind heard that, and I literally changed the way I viewed school. So now my belief is no longer that school and teachers and classmates are a threat to me, but it's now an opportunity for me to get out of this violent daily grind of being at home. And so from 8th grade, with these kind of chaotic and negative report cards, I went to a honor student my freshman year of high school, simply by changing my behaviors, which came from my beliefs, which changed the outcomes. It literally changed the direct trajectory of my academic life. I didn't get some band of tutors. I didn't move out of my house. My father didn't somehow have an awakening, an epiphany, and stop beating me. But my belief around the value and the opportunity I had at school meant safety. So if I applied myself at school, I could be safe. I changed my behaviors, and I changed the results of my life, which I think is so powerful for people to hear, because literally in any situation that you're facing in your life today, no matter how dark and how dangerous and how overwhelming it may feel, there's a set of behaviors that go along with changing that. And I have a few mentors in my corner these days. George Mumford, who's a mindfulness and performance expert, and Trevor Moawad, who wrote a book called "It Takes What It Takes." And I speak a lot about what I've learned from them. And Trevor talks a lot about how the feelings do fuck with everybody.
Yeah.
But the behaviors you can engage, you can get behind a set of behaviors ultimately if you change the way you believe about what you want and literally change the outcomes of your life. And it's very powerful.
There's two stories that you shared with me. One of them I'll probably never forget. It was about the guy who took the SATs and how it ended up changing how he acted after he got his test score back.
Yeah, it's very similar actually to my story at a different level, right? I mean, this is something that Trevor's dad related to him. Trevor's dad was a member of Toastmasters, and every year the Toastmasters had an annual conference, and some of the best speeches that were given were highlighted, and a man spoke to them who was ultimately the one of the most successful magazine publishers in the United States, and the story that Trevor's dad, Bob Moawad, who passed away a few years ago, tells is that this man at the time, he was a junior in high school, was failing out of school on all levels, academically and conduct-wise. He just
Not
was
doing so well.
Yeah, just a bad apple. It's
so
just
good.
a bad apple. Like me back in 7th and 8th grade, right? And his mother had signed him up for the SATs, to take the SATs in I guess what would be maybe the spring of his junior year. And so, given that she had paid for him to take the test, he took the test. And back when we were growing up, I grew up around the same time as this man. When the story's told, you get a verbal and a math score on your SATs. There were 800 each. A perfect score was 1,600. And so this guy took the SATs and got the results back. And despite all of his behavioral and educational flaws, he got a 1450 on his SATs, which is near impossible. And so his mother, of course, asked him, "Did you cheat?" Because she knew her son. And he said, "No, I mean, the seats were too far apart and these little circles and a number 2 pencil. And so I just took the test." And she goes, "Did you have any idea that you were this bright?" And he said, "No, I just, I just took the test." And so he got behind the fact that he was smart and really decided to then get back and apply himself at school and apply this intelligence that he now realized he had, and got himself through high school, went to a community college, and ultimately graduated from an Ivy League school and became the most successful magazine publisher in the United States. And people think that that's the story, right? The story is he just unlocked this knowledge that he thought he had.
Yeah, he was just doing poorly in school, but he was a genius, so he just needed to start using the horsepower.
Yeah, and that's where the story turns, because the truth is, some period of time, 6 or 7 years later, he got a letter from Princeton, New Jersey, and the board that studies evaluates the SAT scores does like they do every year, and kind of does a test case of all the scores, and he was one of 5 or 6 kids that year that got the wrong test results back in the mail. And so when he got his test results back, he learned that he actually only got a 750 on his SATs. A terrible score. I mean, I think you can get 500 for writing your name. And so it's a funny story, but it's a descriptive story, because much like my own story, what did he do? Well, he did what smart people do, right? He got behind a set of behaviors that go along with getting good grades. He went to classes. He did his homework on time. He turned in his assignments. These very simple behaviors that he could get behind because his belief changed.
Yeah.
Much like my belief changed. And so it changed the trajectory of his life. And at some level, it changed the trajectory of mine. It's a great story, right?
Yeah. No, I mean, I love that story for lots of reasons.
And I think it's true for all of us. And so I got through high school and, continued to drink, continued to lie, and continued to avoid. But I went to a private high school a little away from home. And I want to talk about the importance of resilience. One thing that I'm really clear about when I tell my story, and I want to really be clear about it here because I think it's important, is the importance of resilience. During my life, growing up, at very critical points when I could have gone, down a deeper hole, I was introduced to or people in my life were presented to me that believed in me, just a little bit, And if you're somebody that doesn't relate to what I went through at any level, and you're somebody who's had that kind of fairy tale upbringing from loving parents and a great upbringing, that you can be a source of resilience for sufferers. You don't know what's going on with anybody in your class or a coworker. And so if you can have compassion and empathy, you might be able to literally save somebody's life. There was a family in the town of Scarborough, the Risbera family. Mr. and Mrs. Risbera sadly have both passed away, but that family of 4 kids and Mr. and Mrs. Risbera became much of a surrogate to me. They lived up the street from me. They were a very successful home building developer in the city of Scarborough, and Mr. Risbera, while tough on the outside, was just as soft and as loving and understanding as could be. And whenever I was at their house, I felt safe. And it was those little times of feeling safe that allowed me to regulate a little bit and see and access and have exposure to some normalcy and to being cared about and to have some lunch made for you and not be afraid that when Mr. Risbera came home that I was going to suffer any kind of consequences. And, that family, they continue to be very important in my life today. I worked as a construction labor for them when I was in college. They helped me out when I couldn't ask my parents for help. And, there's those bits of resilience. Same thing with some of my friends at Chevrolet, my friend Joe Napolitano and the McCartneys and Sean Fitzgerald, who passed away. I had this opportunity to connect with some guys, and it's an interesting story. And I tell this story of Joe Napolitano because it's pretty important as it relates to how we see ourselves. So Joe, who remains one of my closest friends, was from sophomore year, he was the starting varsity quarterback for our football team, kind of what I'd consider to be for our year, the big man on campus. And,
right.
I always viewed myself, my view was I was very, very lucky to have this guy as a friend, that it was so great to have him as a friend, but never felt very worthy of his friendship and always kind of felt like a tag along. And we recently spent some time together after I shared my whole story with him, and we were really close in high school. And man, I realized that I was just as good a friend and that my friendship meant just as much to him. And it's so funny that we just don't see ourselves the way other people see us, Chaz,
You realized that you realized that recently?
Yeah, just last year.
Wow.
Last year. And it made Joe and I, closer. And I look forward to seeing him, whenever I get back to Maine, and we talk and text a couple times, every so often now. And it really means a lot to me. But yeah, it's, I just couldn't see myself the way that he saw me. And I think that a lot of us have a book of our own lives, and what I realized is that I let a lot of other people write a lot of negative stuff in the book of my life, and I've kind of taken that pen back and learned that the book of my life is really dependent upon my own views of myself. There's an external influence like my dad or my teachers. Or people that did bully me, and then there's the internal influences, which is what I think of me, and it's much more powerful than what they thought of me. And having those resilient points, whether it be Joe Napolitano or the Risbera family throughout my life, is really, I think, one of the things that, as you get to those low points, just lifted me up enough to kind of take a breath and to keep moving forward and survive. And so I did that through high school. And you ask about college. College was an interesting experience for me. So I applied to a bunch of schools, and I got into several of them. And one of the schools I got into was Fairfield University in Connecticut. And I chose to go there for no other reason except it was the furthest from my house.
Really?
For sure. You look at the map and you look at how close St. Anselm's was or some of these other schools that I applied to, and then you look at Fairfield, like 5.5 hours. That's good.
That's the one.
That's the one. And it was Jesuit school. And so, although I definitely did better in high school, I still had a lot of escaping and a lot of avoiding, and so I always joke I was probably an average B student. And do you know why I wasn't an A student, Chaz? Can you guess?
No.
Because I just didn't do what the kids that got A's did. Plain and simple. I did not get behind those behaviors. I mean, I was surviving, but, not really thriving. And so, but I used all the skills that I had. and all the resources that I had, and fear motivated me. I think everybody knows that fear is a bit of a motivator. Can be. It's not a lasting motivator. It's really not. You hear a lot about fear will motivate you. It's like if you were to be in a car in a movie and you see when they hit that super boost button, the red button, and they get that extra charge.
Yeah, shoot the NOS into the engine.
Yeah, exactly. That's kind of what fear is as a motivator. It's a burst.
Feels about right.
And it'll last for a little while, but it evaporates, and you can't really draw on it long term to propel you forward. And so you need something else, really yourself, your desires, your passions, your beliefs to really motivate you. Make sense?
Yeah, it just also seems a bit unhealthy to be running on fear as a motivator. Because I know I've certainly have for some extended period of time. It's exhausting after a while.
It is exhausting and physically draining, emotionally draining,
yeah,
and biologically draining, because you're operating with increased levels of cortisol and adrenaline and other unhealthy kind of activating chemicals in your body that ultimately will increase your likelihood of depression, anxiety, heart attack, stroke. So yeah, fear is it literally is like that unhealthy boost of a super agent that really does massive damage if you use it too long. I think in some of the war games on the video games, you can get a boost here or there, get some extra bullets, but they just go away, and they don't last. And that was, that's what I learned. So fear motivated me through college, but college was the same thing. So Fairfield was about 5.5 hours from Scarborough, and the night before one of our trips down, I think it was to orientation, when I was to kind of get exposed to Fairfield, I'd started to pack because I was leaving for school shortly thereafter, and my father had come across this kind of pink shirt with a white collar. I always describe it because it's so vivid to me, that had a little gold tie bar that went under it, and I was taking that down to school.
Sounds pretty nice.
Yeah, I thought so too, but apparently my father associated that with the drug dealers, and he made it clear as he walked in my room that taking that shirt down to Fairfield was going to be like announcing to everybody I was a drug dealer, and he got rageful, and his fist clenched, and I knew that tongue came out of his mouth, and I knew what that meant for me, and I guess I was around 17 or 18 at the time, and I just said no more. I didn't have that fight, but I did have that flight. And so I left. I ran down the stairs, and the night before we went down there for orientation, he followed me in his car up the street and drove right at me and was trying to run me over with our Country Squire station wagon. And I escaped, barely, this boulder that was at the bottom of the hill by the Risbera's barn. I was able to dodge around that off the road and kind of saw him veer off the road towards me and just kind of clench his fists on the wheel that he missed me. And I just started walking, and as in most cases in our family, I don't have clear recollection of exactly how it all came down, but my mother came to get me at the Melia's house. I'd walked to Cape Elizabeth, which was probably a 10 or 12 mile walk at the time. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't have anything in my pocket. It was, 1982. There were no cell phones, no Uber, no debit cards. I mean, I was just a kid on the street, just, didn't know what I was going to do. But, like most things in our house, and I think in a lot of houses like mine, things just get swept under the carpet. My mom came to get me and probably said something to the Melias like, oh, well, little Charlie's sensitive, and he just got into a little disagreement with his dad, and, we've got to get him down to Fairfield. And so I went, and, I can remember the ride down to Fairfield, Chaz. It was, I liken it to Aladdin's carpet ride, a whole new world. It was like I was escaping Maine. I was going to leave that version of me behind. No one really knew me down in Connecticut, and I could create this new version of myself. Kind of always had this dream every summer before I went back to school that I could unzip my skin and kind of walk out as, better, faster, stronger than I was when I went home for summer.
I certainly had that same feeling in between school years, right before the school year would start. I'm like, this year I got to cut my hair different, do a whole, all new, different clothes. I always felt that way. So I imagine, especially going to college, it was like you get to recreate yourself. But
yeah, and it was exciting, and here's the interesting thing. That feeling lasted for about 20 minutes. Yeah, 20 minutes. And then it was gone. Because there's an old saying, wherever you go, there you are. And although I was 5.5 hours from Maine, I still was the same scared, afraid, anxious, worried, insecure kid. And so I saw these kids pulling up to Fairfield in their nice cars from the tri-state area, and they were wearing, khaki pants and polo shirts and Reeboks and I always joke it was the 80s and Reeboks were really cool.
Yeah, they're coming back.
They are. They are. I see that now. But I was from Maine, right? I had a pair of Herman Survivor work boots and a jean jacket. And once again, and I want to differentiate. I mean, I think a healthy kid who shows up in that environment with good self-worth looks at that and goes, oh, there's a bunch of great kids that I'm going to get to meet. I'm going to learn some things and I'll see what they're all into. But for me, it was like, oh my God, I don't fit in again. Oh my God, I'm in for the same nauseating ride of not being good enough in a whole new environment. And the bubble, that bubble of everything's going to be great now burst for me, and it became instant sadness and depression again for me, starting freshman year. And obviously being away from home, I could continue to increase the amount of drugs and alcohol I took. And, once again, fear motivated me. My father was a college professor at the University of Southern Maine. So me going to Fairfield was a bit of a status thing for him, his son going to a prominent Northeastern Jesuit university. And he made it clear that if I didn't get good grades at Fairfield, that he'd just haul me out, bring me home, and I could go to University of Southern Maine for free. And so I was
obviously you didn't want that.
Petrified of that. I mean, it literally would be like getting dragged back into a den of flesh-eating lions, for the rest of my life. I mean, it would have been hell. So survival kicks in, right? We do certain things in pattern. We react to fear. We hit that thruster. And I got myself into that kind of skill that I had for compartmentalizing my life. What do I mean by that? I could compartmentalize my drinking, my avoidance, my classwork, so that I could do well enough in school to stay at Fairfield. My body just had the ability. I had no real vision for my life. I had no real dreams or aspirations. I wasn't heading anywhere. I was just surviving. Every day was just survival for me, and it was painful, and it was sad, and it was lonely. And that was exacerbated at Fairfield. I really didn't fit in with the guys that I roomed with freshman year. They all had a close connection from being from a certain area together, and made close friends from that area. And, I kind of got left out of the sophomore year rooming decision. And, fortunately, once again, I believe the universe and the God in my life has a great plan for me. And so I met some kids sophomore year that I went up to room with. And man, I have, as some of the closest friends from college that you could imagine. I've got, 13, 14 really close guys that, I talk to all the time. We go on trips every year, and they were another kind of level of resilience for me. They cared about me. They accepted me for who I was. The kid, Chris McKeon, who invited me up after a snowball fight one winter to come up to this dorm on campus, Jogues. And I met these guys, and really they turned my life around. Saved my life for the next 3 years. I was able to have friends, connect, forget about being at home.
You didn't feel like you fit in before those guys?
I didn't. It was hell for me freshman year. And I'm sure it is for a lot of kids. But knowing that I had that internal belief that something was wrong with me anyways, it made it nauseating. It wasn't just something that I could regulate with kind of a normal kind of mental or physical toughness. It was like I really didn't belong.
Yeah. So let me ask you this then.
Yeah.
Because I know that I think some people don't realize how much they're helping when they just reach out like that. Did they know then, or do they know now how much that helps?
It's such a great question. The answer is no. They didn't know back then. I was still suffering in silence. But they all know now, and to a man, they've all said they just wish, they wish they had known what I was going through back then. I think everybody has that inherent desire to be helpful to people they care about, and as much as they helped me unknowingly, I can't imagine what they would have done had they known the pain I was in. And that's why I always encourage, when I speak at college campuses or to young adults, for people to ask for help, to find somebody they can trust, to share what's going on with them, because there's so many avenues to get help. That I really encourage, whether it's the Office of Student Services, which is behind me as a result of the work I continue to do at Fairfield in the Collegiate Recovery Program, or a professor, that you trust. I had several professors that really helped me. I just encourage people to ask for help.